Amanda introduced Brent BecVar this morning, but I just want to add my 2 cents worth. If you remember from the photographs I was showing right at the beginning of the history of the Chopra Center, you might not remember, but in many of those photographs from way back in our days still in Massachusetts, Brent was there alongside myself and Deepak or whoever. So Brent has been, with Deepak almost as long as me. Maybe he came a few months or so after I started working with Deepak. Brent shows up and he's been, a great supporter and teacher. He was one of the first meditation teachers when there were just a few of us there at the Chopra Center, kind of pioneering all of this stuff. And then he took up, his life's purpose, his dharma of studying Jyotish, Vedic Astrology, and has become, an excellent Vedic astrologer. He's kind of like, I guess we call him the in-house astrologer. Brent offers consultations, so for any of you who would like to have a personal consultation with Brent and learn about all the different aspects of your Jyotish charts and things like that, Brent does it. He won't be doing it here, but there'll be an opportunity for you to sign up, and then Brent makes arrangements and does it over the phone or by Skype or something like that. So there'll be plenty of opportunity. Anyway, I'll get out of the way now, so please welcome Brent BecVar. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Roger. Can you hear me at the back? Yes, it's been a great joy of my life to have come to work with Deepak and the Chopra Center and Roger and all these wonderful people that you're meeting this week over the last, I think, 25, 26 years. But as Roger mentioned, at one point in my journey, I encountered a Jyotishi, a Vedic astrologer, and at the Chopra Center in Massachusetts, or what was then the Ayurveda Health Center in Massachusetts. And my mind was blown. I had always been interested in astrology, even since I was a little child. Anytime I met someone, I would try to find out when they were born. And having that information, I felt like I knew something about them. It gave me a sense about them I didn't have before. And as soon as I found out there was something called astrology, I began to explore it with great interest. And over about 20 years, I studied Western astrology. But it was only when I came to work for Deepak in Massachusetts and met this Jyotishi that I realized, even though I knew there was something to astrology, and I'm going to try to share some of what I understand that to be with you all this afternoon. And this is not to disparage Western astrology, but it didn't quite fit me. I often say I felt like I was trying to squeeze into an article of clothing that I wanted to wear, but for me, it just didn't quite fit. And I know many people get benefit from and derive a lot of insight from Western astrology, and I'm going to explain the difference between Vedic astrology and Western astrology in a little bit. But when I met this Jyotishi in Massachusetts, and he told me about my chart, and as I'll explain, Vedic astrology is distinctly different from Western astrology in a number of very important ways. I felt like this is what I've been looking for my whole life. And suddenly the suit fit, and I was so excited, and I couldn't stop inquiring about this new subject, new to me at the time. And I began to read everything I could find, and I began to explore this conversation with anybody that knew anything about Vedic astrology. And eventually I studied in India, had teachers in India, had a very fine teacher in this country also over a period of about 13 years. And really immerse myself in this. And I'm so grateful that I did, because it's given me a language to understand life. And it's given me a way to contribute to other people. Roger mentioned my Dharma, and it's true. I mean, I really feel like this has become a significant part of my Dharma. And I'm going to try to explain more about why that's so. But first of all, Jyotish, the word Jyotish, I know it's going to be a new word for many of you. Jyotish comes from the Sanskrit Jyoti, which means light, and Isha, which means lord of or science of. So Jyotish is the science of light. And as the science of light, it's not just the exploration and understanding of the relationships between these great luminaries, the stars and constellations and the planets, but also the light of our own consciousness that enables us to perceive and understand. And it's pretty much what we're all about here this week. Jyotish, as I'll explain, is a spiritual subject, a deeply sacred subject. In fact, it's an integral part of the Vedic tradition. It's one of the so-called Vedangas, or the limbs of the Veda. It's referred to as the eye of the Veda because it's associated with light. And it gives us great insight into what I often think of as our own extended body. Deepak talked about the collective soul in that one diagram that we looked at where we were talking about the archetypal themes and the gods and the goddesses. Jyotish kind of falls into that category. And in the same way that Ayurveda, the holistic healing tradition of India, explores deeply the relationship of the physical body to the greater body, Jyotish explores what we might call the astral body, or the body of stars, the subtle body, and our relationship to this greater body of the universe. So, as I said, Jyotish is a sacred subject, and as a sacred subject, and when we dip into this great river of knowledge from the Vedic tradition, the Vedic tradition is truly the oldest coherent body of knowledge that we have as human beings. It's vast and incorporates every aspect of human life, but much beyond that. But when we dip into this great ocean of Vedic knowledge, we want to sort of propitiate and initiate our inquiry today with mantra. And I would like to just do a few simple mantras. We want to always propitiate Ganesh. You've seen Ganesh. Ganesh is here on the stage. Ganesh is often propitiated at the beginnings of things. And we often think of Ganesh as the remover of obstacles when we talk about this archetypal quality of consciousness. But another name for Ganesh is Ganapati. And Ganapati is often referred to as the Lord of categories. So we propitiate Ganesh. Ganesh is actually the Ishtadevata, or the sort of the divine quality of inspiration for Vedic astrologers, because Ganesh sort of, and that quality of consciousness, helps us to put everything, you might say, in its proper order of reality. Because, as we'll see, Jyotish is and can be a very complex subject. So finding the truth within all of this complexity is what we propitiate Ganesh for. And we also propitiate Saraswati. Saraswati is the goddess of wisdom and knowledge and art and music and language and speech. So we propitiate this quality of consciousness that is represented by Saraswati in the Vedic tradition. And we propitiate Surya. Surya is the sun that we propitiate to energize and illumine our inquiry into this body, this Vedic tradition. So I've just asked you to join me for a second and just begin to bring your attention inside for a minute. Close your eyes. And just join me with your attention for a moment. Om Ekadantaya vidmahe vakratundaya dhimahi tanudanti prachodayat. Om Ganganakate Namaha Vagdevyaya cha vidmahe kamapradaya dhimahi tano devi prachodayat. Om Aim Shrim Hrim Saraswati Devye Namaha Prabhakaraya vidmahe divakaraya dhimahi tana surya prachodayat. Om Sum Suryaya Namaha. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvina Vaditamastu Mavidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May the divine protect us. May the divine nourish us. May our study be energetic and illumined. And may no animosity arise among us. Om, peace, peace, peace. Thank you. Now let's begin to slowly open our eyes. I'm always curious to know how many people have had some sort of astrological reading, inquiry of some kind. Raise them high. Let's see. Wow, pretty much everybody. There are just a few maybe that haven't. So we have to ask, why do we inquire into this subject of astrology? Why does it intrigue us? And why do we have a sense that there's something there? Why do we have a sense that there's something for us to understand by exploring this subject? In many ways, astronomy was among the first science in terms of the study of time. You know, the early sky watchers, you might say, began to not only recognize our intimate relationship with these various rhythmicities like the circadian rhythm, you know, the cycles of day and night, our relationship to the sun as the earth turns in its relationship to the sun, and also the seasonal rhythms, you know, as the sun moves in its orbit, as the earth, I should say, moves in its orbit around the sun, at different times of the year, we call it a year, we experience different qualities of the environment, even here in Southern California. And the lunar rhythms, you know, we know, of course, the lunar rhythms have a lot to do with the tidal motions, certainly many cycles in living organisms, reproductive cycles. I have a hard time saying that word sometimes. Reproductive cycles. And other cycles having to do with organisms around the planet. But also these greater rhythmicities having to do with these great planetary bodies. These companions, you might say, in our neighborhood. I just want to point out, for example, the size of Jupiter and Saturn. The pointer is not working here, I don't think very well. Well, there it is. The size of Jupiter and Saturn in relationship to the Earth. Where is the Earth? It's this tiny little thing somewhere in there. There it is, right there. So these are great beings, you might say, that are part of our extended body. And in some ways, the sky watchers of old used to began by observing these cycles, these planetary cycles, began to establish certain or distinguish or cognize certain qualities that could be seen or could be felt, could be experienced in relation to these great beings. In fact, the planets were the gods and goddesses of antiquity. You know, we talk about Mars, for example, as the god of war. Now, Mars is a planet that, in its positive expression, that we often associate with courage, passion, energy. Mars is just about to move into the constellation of Capricorn, as seen from Earth, where it is said to be exalted, very powerful. for a period of some time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But so Mars, courage, passion, energy, but yet it can also be associated with irritability, anger, violence, war, even, depending on our relationship with this particular archetypal quality of Mars. Venus, we know, is the goddess of love. You know, certain people that may have prominent or strong Mars in the horoscope, either Mars happens to be in a very strong position, like I mentioned, it can be exalted in certain constellations, or in one of its own signs like Aries or Scorpio. But also if Mars rules what is called the ascendant, which is a very important part of the Vedic chart. The ascendant, it refers to the fact that in any moment as the Earth is turning, we say in its eastern direction, in relation to the sun, you know, the sun doesn't rise, we just turn in relation to the sun. The sun appears to rise. But in the same way, different constellations will appear to rise on the eastern horizon at different times of the day and night. Right now, at this moment, in fact, there is one particular constellation that is appearing on the eastern horizon. And in all of our lives, when we were born, and Deepak talked a little bit about the moment of birth and how important the moment of birth is. So when we were born, there was one or another of the 12 so-called constellations that was appearing on the eastern horizon, and a certain degree of that 30 degrees of that constellation. And that constellation and the degree of that constellation sets up all the relationships of the planets in our solar system at the time of our birth, to the event of our birth. And truly gives us clues about our personality, our physical body, the way we present ourselves to the world. Now, trust me, I've been doing this for 25 years, something like this. I've been deeply immersed in this study, and I've been looking at thousands of charts, and oftentimes charts of people that I don't even know before that, don't know anything about them. But by knowing this date, time, and place of birth, and by determining which constellation was appearing, you get all sorts of understanding about the archetypal themes that person is sort of expressing in life. As I said, when Mars is a strong planet in a person's chart, those are the people that are kind of type A, Pitta. We know, some of you know the qualities of Pitta dosha in Ayurveda, the fiery metabolic quality. Mars people often are self-starters. They're action-oriented. We see a lot of fine athletes have strong Mars, and warriors, and kind of litigators, and sales, really self-starting salespeople, for example, have strong Mars. Venus, people that have more Venus associated with their in Venusian themes as seen in their horoscope. These are more relational people that are interested in harmony and relationship. Not so much the case with Mars. Mars people, they're not about harmony. They're about what's in it for me a lot of the times. How can I get what I want? So Venus people can learn a lot from Mars people, and Mars people can learn a lot from Venus people. And what I'm speaking here of is certain ascendants, certain rising signs, certain constellations are ruled by one or another of these great beings, these planets. And so there are 12 different constellations or 12 different rising signs. So everybody in this room has one or another of those 12 ascendants. And each one of those rising signs, so-called, and we're going to look at a chart, we're going to look at Deepak's chart for a little bit, just to kind of give an illustration of this. Each one of these so-called rising signs is ruled by one or another of these planets. Aries, as I mentioned, is ruled by Mars. Taurus is ruled by Venus. And by the way, I'm not speaking of your sun sign now, so if you're making an association between what I'm saying and your sun sign, we're going to see how that's very different in Vedic astrology. Gemini is ruled by Mercury. So some people are very mercurial. Mercury is the planet we often refer to as the messenger of the gods. Mercury is associated with the intellect and with communications. People that have voracious intellects and are very interested in communications. So Gemini, and as we'll see, Virgo is also ruled by Mercury. Then comes Cancer. Cancer, a water sign, is ruled by the moon. So the moon and certain themes around the moon are expressed in people that are Cancer rising. Moon is associated with nurturing and motherhood and oceans. Cancer people are very nurturing, tend to be very sensitive, extremely sensitive. But that sensitivity has both challenges but also blessings for people with that rising sign. Leo. Leo is ruled by the sun. Sun is the planet or the planetary body of boundless energy. It's boundlessly generous. The Leo people are often givers. People with Leo ascendant in the Vedic system. And I think before I go on with the ascendants, I just want to explain that there is a distinct difference, as I mentioned, between Vedic astrology and Western astrology. Vedic astrology uses what is called the sidereal zodiac. The sidereal zodiac refers to the fixed constellations as we see them in the sky. The same constellations that any astronomer would see, what is observable. Western astrology uses what is called the tropical zodiac. And some of you may have more experience with Western astrology. The tropical zodiac, in this case, tropical means movable. And it refers not to the fixed constellations, but rather the relative and changeable position of the sun. So it's a solar-based or seasonal astrology. That's why the sun sign is very important in Western astrology. So again, I'm not diminishing in any way Western astrology, but I have to say, and this is the truth, that it's not accurate to the observable constellations. It doesn't make it wrong or irrelevant, but it has to be read with that understanding. So Vedic astrology then, when we look at a Vedic chart, as I said, we'll look at Deepak's chart in a minute, uses this sidereal zodiac, what any astronomer would have seen at the time of each of our births, for example. So the first thing we look at is the rising sign. And, I did want to just hearken back for just a moment to what I first started to say about every exalted culture has had astrology/astronomy as part of its deeper wisdom, that it is in fact the study of time. And, we talk about one day having to do with the circadian rhythm, when the sun appears to set and when it appears to rise, that time in between we call night, and when the sun seems to rise or appears to rise and continues, and we get up and are animated and we have we're creative and we have our lives, we call that day. The lunar rhythms relates to month, and the yearly rhythms, of course, the seasonal rhythms, relates to year, the cycle of the earth around, making a full cycle around the sun. But also, this phenomenon of time was seen and recognized in the cycles of these great planets. So the reason I feel that this is such an important subject is because it really does help to establish a more coherent and harmonious relationship with this greater body that is always part of our experience. And even though we may not be aware of it, as we become more sensitive, as we become more connected, as Deepak said, as we expand our beingness, we begin to recognize that we are not separate. We're not separate from one another. We're not separate from this greater body of the environment at all. And this illusion of separateness is what kind of keeps us in a state of illusion and suffering. So beginning to explore these greater rhythmicities and these greater archetypal themes as seen in the planetary cycles helps us in many ways to open ourselves to the unity with all that is. And there's a great deal of knowledge that can be gleaned from opening our awareness to these planetary archetypes. Everything is connected. Everything is connected, always. So why do we look into astrology? Because my feeling is we really want to find out how to align in a harmonious way with not only one another, but with our environment, our immediate environment, but also this greater body of the environment, from which we draw tremendous energy and knowledge and insight. So, as I mentioned, all these planets have different archetypal themes. So each of us has one or another of these 12 rising signs. As I said, each of the rising signs is ruled by or represented by one of these particular planets. I just want to further explain that and this slightly technical details here, but the reason that Western astrology and Vedic astrology are different is because the position where the sun rises every spring equinox, in Western astrology we refer to this as the beginning of the sign of Aries, March the 21st, the spring equinox. And in fact, the sun hasn't risen in the constellation of Aries in over 1,700 years. It's been precessing or being seen to move backwards through the zodiac at the rate of about 1 degree every 72 years. So it's been moving through the constellation of Pisces. Hence, we've been in what is called the Piscean age. And yet, in just not too many more years, the sun will precess and begin to rise in the constellation of Aquarius. Hence the expression, the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Many of us have heard this expression. And this heralds a whole new period of time for us as a planet. And it takes 2,000 years for that precession to occur through each constellation, or a total of somewhere between 24 and 26,000 years for that cycle of precession to go through all of the 12 constellations. Now, there's a whole other subject I would love to share about with you having to do with these great spans of time. In the Vedic tradition, they're referred to as the yugas. The yugas, and there are a period, according to this system, where there is a declining period of consciousness for 12 to 13,000 years when the sun is moving through certain of these constellations. And then we go through a very dark age, often referred to as Kali Yuga. Some of you have heard that term. The good news is we are emerging and have actually emerged out of Kali Yuga, the 5,000 years of Kali Yuga. However, we're at this change of an age where we're moving into an ascending bronze. The Kali Yuga is referred to as the lead age. We're moving into this new age called Dwapar Yuga in the Vedic tradition, or the ascending bronze age, which lasts for a period of several thousand years. Then we'll move into a period of ascending silver age, which is called Treta Yuga, and then the golden age, what's called Sat Yuga. Some of you have heard that term, Sat Yuga, which is the age of enlightenment. So the good news is, according to this system, we're merging out of a very dark age when there was great illusion and separation and violence, and I don't even need to go into it. I don't even like to think about it. But when we move into a change of age, as we're doing now, there's often a lot of upheaval. There's a lot of shifting in that the old forms are not working anymore. The old governmental forms, the old religious forms, the old economic forms, the old social forms that maybe we'd held on to for a long time in this previous age, they're starting to fall apart. And many people are in fear about this. And we see this in the rise of fundamentalism, people holding on desperately to something that they think will give some security or stability to them, or extreme conservatism. So a lot of these old forms will have to fall away and give birth to a new consciousness, a new way of being, a new way of living. And there will be new forms that will develop, new ways of having government, and new religious forms in some ways, new spiritual forms, new economic forms, social forms, and so on. But at the change of an age, there's a lot of chaos, and that's really what we're seeing right now. And so I just want to acknowledge that all of us here who are, sensing this shift and are wanting to be in this new consciousness, and are in this new consciousness, in fact, we're sort of, part of the wave, part of this new wave. And in doing things like we're doing here at this retreat, we're helping so many people. And that's why, I so support Deepak's vision of 1 billion people meditating, because that's what we need, more and more people that are meditating like we are doing here, and influencing others in creating more coherence on the planet. It's not an idealistic thing. It's a reality. And it's going to happen. It's going to change. We have to go through a lot of the upheaval and turmoil before it does. But anyway, that's a big subject, and I really want to just say that, I'm very grateful to Deepak, because it was after I'd been studying for about 10 years, and studying really intensely, and was just so on fire with this knowledge. And I would do charts for anybody. I just loved it. I loved being able to, it was like opening a new book every time I looked at a chart. And it becomes such an intimate connection with another person, because you see the reflection of what we could call karma. Karma, today is the law of karma. Karma is reflected in the horoscope, for better or for worse. I mean, there are certain talents, gifts, and abilities that we all have. Each of us have certain talents, gifts, and abilities. And some of these are very clearly seen in a horoscope. Sometimes it's musical talent, sometimes it's mathematics, sometimes writing, sometimes athletic abilities, things like that. And at the same time, you can also see some of the challenges that may exist for us. And we all have them in our horoscope, because certain planetary archetypes represent what we might call malefic influences in the life. Particularly the planet Mars and the planet Saturn are difficult influences in the chart. They have their good side, as I said about Mars. Mars gives courage, passion, energy. Saturn can give great discipline, great ability to work hard, humility, patience, practical wisdom, common sense, all of these kinds of things. And yet, Saturn, when it influences certain parts of the horoscope, it's like having your foot on the brakes. It's like it keeps us fearful, keeps us a little bit apprehensive. We remember things that happened in the past, and things that we might experience remind us of things, and we want to avoid what we didn't like about the past happening in the present. So Saturn keeps us a little bit constrained. Mars, on the other hand, is about like foot on the gas. It's like, what's next? What's next? What's next? What's next? It's like, getting to some future, some imagined future. And we have to acknowledge that neither of these are real. The future is just imagination. The past is memory. So Mars and Saturn sometimes can trip us up, let's just say, depending on where they're placed in the chart. So we look at all of these planetary archetypes in a particular horoscope to see where are the strengths, where are the gifts, and how can we look to the positive traits and qualities of the archetypal themes that are prominent in a horoscope, and how can we mitigate some of the challenges that may be there. Now, we have the basic birth chart, which sort of sets the tone, you might say, for our lives, but there are also very important features in the Vedic chart. One is called the Dasha sequence, or the planetary period sequence. Each of us in this room is going through a particular planetary period. Some of these periods are very short, like the Sun period is 6 years long, and the Venus period is 20 years long, so some are quite long. Each of these planetary periods, you might say, and it's been my experience to observe this in thousands of charts, when you're in a particular planetary period, it evokes and activates some of the qualities of that planet as it may appear in the chart, for better or for worse. So these planetary periods are extremely important. We also look at the current transits of where the planets are right now in relation to an individual chart. We particularly pay attention to these great big planets like Jupiter and Saturn. And when I'm doing charts, I pay special attention to Jupiter, because Jupiter, the word for Jupiter in Sanskrit is guru, just like a teacher. Guru, it means remover of ignorance. So Jupiter is this great benefic planet, we say, that is the deliverer of grace and the planet that draws us toward consciousness. So we see Jupiter very prominently placed in the charts of people like us here that are drawn to this kind of knowledge. And particularly when people get a Jupiter period. The Jupiter period is a period of 16 years. Now, by the way, these planetary periods are set in motion for each of us by the position of the moon when we're born. I'm not going to try to explain how this happens, but in the same way that we talked about the moon as being the source, or the position of the moon as being the source of our primordial sounds, the bija sounds, the seed sounds that are associated with not only the 27 positions of the moon in its orbit around the Earth as seen from Earth, but also within each of those 27 positions there are 4 subdivisions called padas. And each of these and that's 4 times 27, it makes 108. Many of you know that number as a mystic number, and there's all kinds of reasons in Vedic science why 108 is an important number. But there are 108 actual positions of the moon. So each of us in this room has the moon in one of those 108 positions. And each of those positions has to do with one or another of these seed sounds, as well as each one of those positions will set in motion whatever planetary period we began life in. And then the sequence unfolds from there, from the time we're born until the time we leave the body. And by the way, the total span of all the planetary periods is 120 years. And in the Vedic tradition, we say that the natural lifespan of a human being is 120 years. You know, if we're all living in the best sort of environments and circumstances, eating the right foods, hanging out with sattvic, peaceful people, you know, if we're living really good lives, and that's another whole study, is what that means. What does that mean to live a really good life? You know, we may live to be 120 years. So those of us that are approaching or even at our 60th year, that's a big celebration in India. Shashti Purti. Shashti Purti is the celebration of midlife, where we celebrate all the choices that got us to that point. And by the way, that's the only time that Saturn and Jupiter come back to the place where they were when we were born. So it marks a whole new plateau of life. And so at our 60th year, we set the tone for the next half of our lives. Anyway, I appreciate you bearing with me through some sort of abstract concept, what might feel like abstract concepts to us. But let's look at a little bit of an example. By the way, I'm going to just go through some slides here. This is something that illustrates the 26,000-year precessional cycle. If you're interested in learning more about that, I want to just recommend a very good film you can watch for free on YouTube, and I highly recommend this film. It's called The Great Year. The Great Year. Y-E-A-R. The Great Year. It is narrated by James Earl Jones. It is produced by a very fine astrophysicist named Walter Crittenden. And it goes into some detail not only about the astronomy and the sort of the actual physics of what's happening with precession of equinoxes, but also it goes into talking about these yugas, these planetary periods, and how they may affect us and are affecting us. It's a wonderful film. It's only about 45 minutes long. You can watch it on YouTube for free. The Great Year. It's another example of precession. I'm not going to dwell on that right now. It's something to explore a little bit. This slide shows the yugas, the planetary yugas. Again, it looks kind of complex to look at it, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it right now. But it relates to these great spans of time that have to do with descending periods of consciousness. Fortunately, we're done with that for a while, and now we're in this ascending period of consciousness, 12 to 13,000 years. Something to feel, some hope about and feel encouraged about, even in this period of great transition. I did mention, what does it mean to live a good life? This is part of the theme that's explored in the Vedic chart. There's something in Vedic science referred to as the Purusharthas. The Purusharthas are the 4 aims of life. And these 4 aims of life are explored in all the books of the Vedas, the great Upanishadic epics like the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, as well as the Rig Veda, because these so-called four aims of life are active in all of us all the time. But some of us are more inclined toward one or another of these aims of life, and this can be seen in the Vedic chart. The first of the four aims of life, and we're going to look at this when we look at Deepak's chart in a second. The first is dharma. We heard this expression, dharma. I like to refer to dharma as being the way we seek to align in a harmonious way with natural law. We could talk about it as our moral values. You know, it's sort of what many religions are based on, trying to keep us making good choices so that we don't go into conflict with nature, because then we suffer, then we experience disease and difficulty in our lives. So finding out how to navigate natural law. Now, dharma, we talk about dharma as being our life purpose. But the fact is, when we align with our own nature, what we actually are, and this is what can be seen in the Vedic chart, and this is what I love to sort of help people discern, is what are your natural talents, gifts, and abilities? And if you begin to favor those and align with those, we start to see that nature supports us. Many of us have had this experience. I certainly did when I dove deeply into this study. This was really in alignment with my nature, and I can sure see it in my chart. But sometimes, maybe it's music, maybe it's some field like architecture, or maybe it's something, so the sciences, there can be many things. These kinds of things show up in the chart. But we always want to pay attention to dharma because it's always seen as the very first of the purusharthas. The reason is that if we align with dharma, we're going to attract the resources in our lives that are going to support our living our purpose, that will support us living our purpose. And we're not going to be overly preoccupied with more and more and more stuff, trying to fill up some kind of empty place in ourselves, thinking that that's going to give us happiness. Because it never does. Stuff, it doesn't do it unless we're in alignment with dharma first. And we also don't want to pursue more and more and more pleasure in order to fill up what might feel like an empty place in ourselves. Unless we're in alignment with dharma, we don't know what relationships, for example, are going to support us in our purpose. And finally, our spiritual lives are very much associated with the fourth aim of life, which I'll talk about in a minute. But so dharma is that which sustains law and order in the universe. So everything has dharma. Everything in nature. We see the grass, and we'll hear more about this later in the week as we talk about the law of dharma. But even the planets and the sun have their dharma. And that's what we see in the study of astrology, is sort of what is the dharma, and how is that dharma being expressed in the lives of individuals. So that which sustains law and order in the universe, how we seek to align with our own nature and with natural law. And the inquiry around dharma is, how do I fit into this great play? Well, we see this in the Vedic chart because each of the 12 constellations, as seen from the rising sign, have to do with one or another of these four aims of life. And I'll explain more in a minute. So Artha is the second of the four aims of life. Artha refers to resources. Often it's seen as money or stuff. It's our cars, our houses, our clothes. It's the food we eat. It's the money we earn. It's all the stuff that we acquire and collect in order to feel somewhat secure, to establish our survival values, but even beyond that, to feel safe and secure. Artha has to do with our economic values, how we relate to things in terms of economics. It has to do with prosperity and maintenance. It has to do with resources, as I mentioned. And the inquiry around this artha is, what are the means, what are the stuff I need in order to support my purpose? So it's very important that we have a sense of purpose first in order to see artha in proper relationship. The third of the four aims of life is kama, as in Kama Sutra. Kama refers to, it means enjoyment. Kama, when we have established our basic survival needs, then we want to expand our enjoyment. We want to enjoy more. And often when we do that, we want to look for other people to share that experience, right? Share pleasure with. So karma has a lot to do with our relationships. We could call it our psychological values. It has to do with desire and relationships, enjoyment. What gives me pleasure and what gives pleasure to others is the inquiry that we have around karma. The fourth of the aims of life is moksha. Many of you know this term moksha. Moksha means liberation, self-realization. It's pretty much what Deepak talks about all the time in terms of consciousness. Consciousness is the context of every experience that we have, of all the sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. All of these are experienced in consciousness. So our spiritual values helps us to expand our awareness of this greater context of a consciousness, which is actually who we really are, which is our true nature. You know, we're not the body. The body, as Deepak often points out, is changing. We make a completely new one about every 2 years, so that can't really be who we are. It's like changing clothes. As he says, the body is not a noun, it's a verb. And the same with personality. It changes all the time depending on who we're with and what we're doing. You know, personality is our song and dance that we have cultivated in order to feel safe in the world, or ego. And our roles are changing all the time. We have many roles that each of us play. So those can't really be who we are because they're changing. And the relationships change. So if all these things are changing and can't really be who we are, then who are we is the question. Who am I? And that's such an important question. And that's really what moksha relates to, is opening ourselves to that being, which is the context in which all of everything else takes place. So again, it gives a quality of appreciation, our spiritual life, moksha, self-realization and liberation. And the inquiry here is, who or what am I really? And freedom through self-knowledge. So I just want to point out before I show Deepak's chart that these are two examples of the Vedic chart. The one on the left is the South Indian style of chart, and the one on the right is the North Indian style of chart. I don't expect you to, attach to this too much, but they are different. I use both of them when I'm doing charts for different reasons. But I just want to point out that we're going to look at the South Indian chart for right now. Let's just focus on that. The constellation of Aries is always the first constellation. It's the first in the sequence of the 12. And then after that comes Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, and Virgo, and so on. So when each of us are born, our rising sign relates to one of those 12 constellations. Now, when we're studying a chart, that rising sign becomes the first house. And say, like with Deepak's chart, as we'll see, his rising sign is Aquarius. So even though it has the number 11 there, which is the 11th sign, in the South Indian chart, Aquarius becomes the first house. And therefore, Pisces is second house, Aries third, Taurus fourth, and Gemini, and so on. Each of these so-called houses have to do with different areas of the life experience. And as they relate to the Purusharthas, the first house, the fifth house, and the ninth house, even in the natural zodiac, have to do with dharma, the fire element. In this case, Aries, Leo. I don't want to confuse you with too many details. Even though we propitiated Ganesh, it gets a little bit overwhelming, these details. But the point I want to make is that each of the 12 houses in the chart have to do with one or another of the four aims of life. So the first house, fifth house, and ninth house are houses of dharma. The second house, sixth house, and 10th house are houses of artha, having to do with wealth and how we acquire resources. The third house, seventh house, and 11th house have to do with relationships primarily, familial relationships, intimate partnerships, friendships, and associations. And then the fourth house, eighth house, and 12th houses of the chart have to do with moksha and our spiritual life and our inclination to surrender our separateness to something bigger, to that something bigger. So I just want to show you Deepak's chart here for a second. Now, I don't expect you're going to be able to see it all, and I apologize for that, but there's a lot of stuff you don't need to focus on here right now, stuff that I have to kind of sift through when I look at a chart. But mainly, I just want to point out that Deepak, because of the date, time, and place of his birth, according to the Vedic and sidereal zodiac, we see that the constellation of Aquarius was rising at about 24 degrees, 23 minutes. And therefore, Aquarius becomes the first house of Deepak's chart. And all the other 11 houses are determined according to the natural order of the zodiac from there. So Pisces, second house, Aries, third house, Taurus, fourth, and so on. So it's very important that we know what the houses are, and there's so much information that we get from these houses. I just want to say it's a little too much to try to explain here now. But we talk about the 4 elements, and even the 5 elements, including the etheric element, can be seen in the chart. And these give us information about a particular person, about each of us. It gives us information about ourselves. We look at, there's too much, I'm not going to try to explain everything in an hour. What am I doing? But anyway, I do want to use Deepak's chart as a kind of a simple illustration to be seen. So Deepak's rising sign is Aquarius. Now, as I mentioned, each rising sign is ruled by a particular planet. In this case, Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. So we see that Saturn, in Deepak's chart, is in the 6th house. The 6th house has to do with illness, adversity, enemies, and overcoming illness, adversity, and enemies. So it gives him a natural tendency to be of service, to help other people overcome illness, adversity, and enemies. Oh God, I'd love to be able to share everything about his chart, because as you can imagine, he's got a fascinating chart. But what I really want to tell you about right now is that when Deepak went into the major period of Jupiter, I talked about those planetary periods, this was around 1983. His whole life changed. Even though he had a moderately successful career as a endocrinologist, and he was chief of staff at New England Memorial, when he went into the Jupiter period, first of all, that's when he began to meditate. He was pretty stressed out before then, he'll acknowledge. He was sort of off track, health-wise, stress-wise, everything. One of his nurses suggested that he learn meditation, and for whatever reason, he said, yeah, I think I need to do that. Well, he did, and his whole life changed. He began to shift. This was at the beginning of the Jupiter period. As I said, Jupiter is guru. So it happened, as it happens for a lot of people, and myself included, when we go into the Jupiter period, we're attracted. We have a sense that there's something bigger going on. We have a kind of spontaneous awakening, and we're often attracted to teachers, teachings, systems of knowledge. Deepak met his guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the next year. Happened to me. I met my guru in Swami Satchidananda at that time in my 20s, right as I went into the Jupiter period. I was sitting there listening to Amanda yesterday, or maybe it was this morning, and I realized there's Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Anyway, so I was sitting back there, I was thinking, my God, Amanda's in the Jupiter period, Renee is in the Jupiter period, Rebecca is in the Jupiter period, Kelly is in, all these people were sitting right in front of me, and I thought, each one, and Roger is just beginning his Jupiter period. I'm very excited about Roger's chart. In fact, this is going to be a whole new kind of wonderful time in his life. But anyway, so when Deepak went into the Jupiter period, his whole life changed. And it combined with a number of other planets to create what are called Raja Yogas, royal unions, where suddenly he began to study and teach and travel and write and publish, and gradually his fame rose, his wealth rose, his influence rose. All this can be seen because you see Jupiter in his chart is in the 9th house, the house of the guru, the house of the teacher, house of higher knowledge, house of religion, philosophy, and long-distance travel, which Deepak hasn't seemed to stop doing in the whole time since then. But this is the kind of thing we look for in a chart. We look for what planetary period is a person in, what combinations are there with that planet in the chart, and what can we kind of anticipate? And we look for, of course, the gifts. What's going to help move us into a greater experience of life? But we also sometimes encounter the challenges. So we look for how can we mitigate some of these challenges. Well, certainly all of us here on this course are doing one of the most important things for mitigating the challenges, because the challenges are old habits, old karma, like the influence of Saturn and Mars. These are old habits that we're trying to, old conditioning, old programming that we're trying to kind of rise out of, let go of. Meditation is one of the best upayas, or remedial measures for, overcoming challenging karma. And the Vedic tradition has so many of these remedial measures, and we'll be hearing more about some of these this week. I know I'm running out of time, and I guess you can tell I'm kind of enthusiastic about the subject, and I would love to be able to share more, and I appreciate your being so attentive. But as Roger mentioned, and I want to do this to be fair, because people have asked me, I don't do consultations during the course. Obviously, you're very busy with everything on the course, and I would need time to prepare. So I do these over Zoom. Some of you know Zoom.com. It's like Skype. It's free to use and free to download. And I do offer these sessions. It's a great privilege for me, as I said, to do this kind of work with people. And I'm eternally grateful to Deepak and to another important teacher that he and I met in India, who I feel really helped me to move into this work. But it's a great privilege for me to have this intimate connection with people. So I take it very seriously, and I do it because I love to share about this, and I want to help. And this is one way that I get to help. So I'll just say, if you're interested in doing something like this with me, as I said, we're not going to do it this week. The volunteers have some of the forms. If you just raise your hand, and keep your attention on me just for a second, but raise your hands if you want one of these forms. You don't have to fill out the whole thing. You don't have to fill out the whole thing. It's fill out as much as you can, though. It helps me. But just so I can get in touch with you, I'll have my assistant contact you, and we'll set up a consultation over Zoom sometime in the next few months. And there's much more to say about this consultation, about what you can expect and what you can gain. There's a couple of good videos on the Chopra website about this. I'll be around, the rest of the week if you want to grab me and talk to me about questions that you have, because we don't have time for them right now. And I can feel you're ready to eat dinner, and I'm hoping I've maybe stimulated your digestion a little bit, your appetite a little bit for dinner. The one question I want to be sure to mention about is the birth time. It is critical to have a relatively accurate birth time for the chart. Some of you may not know your birth time. There are ways to get it. So again, this is something we can talk about when we connect on the phone. And but just please put your contact information if you'd like to do this. I would love to be able to get to know each of you individually, as I said, through the chart. So I'm going to honor my commitment to adjourn at this time. But yeah, and what I'll ask you to do is, if you fill these out, the best thing to do is I try to contact people in the order that I get them. So if you're keen to do this with me, please just put your contact information and whatever else you can put on there and give it to me here before you go to dinner. Is that okay to request? Yes. That way I'll contact you in the order that I get the form. So wait, just afterward, okay? Yeah, so I just want to say I'm deeply grateful for your attention over this hour. I hope this hasn't seemed overwhelming. I hope that maybe you get some of the spirit of it. I wouldn't expect you to grasp onto too many of the details, because there are so many more details. But I want you to know that this is something that helps us. It's like a darpana, we call it in Sanskrit, which means a mirror. It's holding up a mirror. So we get to see ourselves a little more objectively. Because the truth is, none of this is personal. As much as we think it is, it's not personal. And that's one of the things that the exploration of Jyotish can help us to see, that we're just an agglomeration of these archetypal themes. We're the witness of it. We're the consciousness in which all of this stuff is taking place. But it helps us to let go of this, me-ness, and get that we're a part of everything. So thank you, everyone, for your attention. And I'll be here if you want to talk to me after. Yeah. Thank you.
How does meditation fit into this and maybe set this